Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Hokyoji Sunday Dharma Talk. Today am introducing Reverend Jushin Stephyn Butcher. He started his Buddhist journey over 25 years ago in the Tibetan tradition. He found his way to Hokyoji, where he became a student of Reverend Dokai Georgesen. Jushin received jukai in 2013 and ordination in 2017. He is currently Hokyoji's board president. He hosts a sitting group on the banks of the Choptank River in Cambridge, Maryland, where he resides with his husband, dog, chickens, and garden. Thank you, Jushin, for offering to speak with us today. And I will turn it over to you to hear what we have to say.
Thank you, Dokai.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's not very many of us this morning. I think we must have all gone to the just sitting retreat or something.
Many people are there, yes.
Yeah. Um, so this will be a little bit interesting because I don't know, with a small group. This So last time I spoke about the title of my talk, Buddha was born in Kapilavastu. And it was meant to start off sort of a series talking about a little bit about the history of Buddhism and different the early teachings of Buddhism, and then about different schools and sects of Buddhism. Last time I talked about the sort of broad history of kind of the human race. We started in Africa, and we ended up in the Gangetic Plain. And we talked about how, I guess about at least probably 1,000 years prior to the Buddha, that there had been the invasions of the Aryans who came in from the steppes of Europe. They went, west into the rest of what we consider today to be Western Europe, and Greece and Italy and all of that, and they went east into India, and that explains like commonalities, even things like different, very similar gods in our mythologies, but more concretely commonalities in, say, Sanskrit and Latin and Greek. And then we talked a little bit about the history of the sort of the Vedic Brahmanism that set the background for the Buddha and the Shramana movement, and how it was a reaction to Vedic Brahmanism, and really it was the countercultural event of its day. Very much not unlike the 60s, maybe in the United States and elsewhere. But it was an interesting time across the globe. It's called I think they call it the Axial Age, when we have other great thinkers, the Abrahamic prophets, and in Greece are all arising at the same time. In a lot of places, there's sort of the same level of social and economic development. Today, since eventually I want to talk about the Buddha's life and the Buddhist teachings, what I wanted to talk about today is the Pali Canon itself. And this is sort of, and so this is why maybe this, I'm sorry, this is going to, maybe I can turn it into be a little bit more interactive, because this is probably the most egg-headed thing I'm ever going to do. And that I looked, there's a particular text and other texts. This is by Bhikkhu Sujatu and Bhikkhu Brahmali. Forget when it was published. It's fairly recent. It's a 158-page paper called The Authenticity of the Early Buddhist Texts. So what they mean by the early Buddhist text is the four Nikayas, and the parallel Agama literature, some of the Vinaya, and portions of the Khuddaka Nikaya, basically the Sutta Nipata, Udana, What is that? Ituvataka, kind of part of the Dhammapada. We'll talk about that later. And the Tera and Therigatha. Those sort of, as you get to the Kudaka Nikaya, the fidelity sort of begins to fade. And it's actually an interesting contrast to the four main Nikayas. So what is their claim about authenticity? Are they claiming that the Pali Canon is the absolute irrefutable truth? And that is not what they're claiming. What they're claiming is that there is sufficient evidence within, if there's 158 pages of it, to at least infer that they're just going to come out and say that there was the texts, the early Buddhist texts derived. Let me see, I can phrase it better. There's a scholar who puts it very succinctly. This is Zhejiang. The basic ideas of Buddhism found in the canonical writings could very well have been proclaimed by, I'll just say Gautama Siddhartha, transmitted and developed by his disciples, and finally codified in fixed formulas. That is the Pali Canon, for a variety of reasons, and I will go into some of them, but not all of them, because that would be multiple talks, is consistent with itself and other things in such a way that we have a high confidence that it was composed certainly shortly after the Buddha's death. Now, shortly in the ancient world probably means within 100 years. Now, let me just contrast to some of the Sujato and Brahmali. They draw a parallel to climate deniers. So it's like the most of the scholars who work in the early Buddhist texts are confident that they are authentic within this definition, whereas a lot of scholars who sort of work in the later texts are much more skeptical. So Jeffrey Samuel says the Pali Canon largely derives from the work of Buddhaghosa and his colleagues in the 5th century CE. So that would be, 800 years after the Buddha's death. So I'll go over a timeline in a minute. So that, that's 900 years. Oh, no, 400. I always hate the century thing. So the 5th century is the 400s. So about 800 years after the Buddha's death. Chopin says it is not until the 5th or 6th century that we can know anything definite about the contents of the canon, sort of how it got to be the way it is. And Sujato and Brahmali are arguing, and a number of scholars do, that this is just simply not the case, that there are compelling reasons why we might believe that the texts were, the texts are authentically from a period much earlier, much closer to the time of the Buddha. So we'll talk about that. And then, so one can reasonably ask, who cares? And actually, Sujato and Brahmali sort of answer this question. They sort of talk about, there's sort of, two schools of thought, like, well, it's obvious. And then the other one is like, well, why does it matter? Or it's hopeless, or we can't really say anything about that. And, they really do sort of pin it down on, if you're a Buddhist, it's kind of important to know about this, sort of where the early writings of Buddhism came from, regardless of what happens down the line. Because again, they're not claiming that this is the one true, that everything that's in there is true, infallible, or that sort of thing. They're just saying that, no, this is probably pretty close to what the teachings, were, and how they were understood at the time. So that's what I want to talk about. They go through all kinds of evidence. So they look at history and geography. So they look about what we know about political and geographic changes in the Gangetic Plain. We're sort of lucky, unlucky, I'm sure for the Indians at the time. There were no Indians at the time, but the people of the Gangetic Plain. Uh, it was a rough time, simply because there was a large amount of political upheaval shortly after the Buddha's death. They look at the economic conditions, social conditions. They even look at writing. They look at the religious context of the early Buddhist texts. So contact with other religions, especially Jainism, Brahmanism. They talk about the unity of the coherence of the teachings. I think the one that I have the most skepticism about, and this is one I'm going to concentrate on to begin with, is the idea of textual transmission. So how is it even possible that all of this stuff, to us in the sort of modernish age, the idea of the correct oral transmission of these kinds of texts seems impossible, if not daunting. And then they talk about the character of the early Buddhist texts, sort of the Vedic influences, literary features, flavor of a single creator, that sort of thing. They go into the archaeology, and they talk about theoretical considerations. So I guess the main thing, and I noticed that we sometimes do it, and I guess there's a bit of a hedge, or there can be a bit of a hedge. It's like sometimes, I don't know, when we go through Pali Canon, we feel a little bit embarrassed. Like, oh, well, this might not have been what the Buddha said and stuff. And I think what interests me about this most is when next time I speak, we start talking about the life of the Buddha, it's kind of important to know or have a sense of the correctness of the texts within a certain delta of 100 years, not 800 years. And I think, just basically we don't need to be quite as embarrassed, I think, saying it. So again, the one that interests me the most is the whole idea of textual transmission and how this works. So the main and interesting thing to me is that, so Buddhism, as we talked about last time, arises in the context of Vedic Brahmanism. And Vedic Brahmanism had at least existed, so the Rig Veda had been an oral transmission for 2,000 years at that point. And it's interesting to me because I was reading somebody's blog post by a Hindu who was talking about oral transmission, and even up to 100 years ago, and even today, it's still important to them not to write things down, because the sounds themselves are considered to be what would the word be? The sounds themselves are considered to be part of the message. They are part. So at least in the Vedic tradition, the Rig Veda is not conceived of as having been composed by anybody, but the sounds were communicated to the first Vedic priests. And so it was very important for them to pass these sounds exactly as they were down from teacher to student and among groups. And at least in the Vedas, there's a lot of what we call in programming checksums. So in programming, a checksum is you take a block of text and you calculate a number for it. And if any of the text changes, that number would change. So it's something a little more sophisticated than counting the number of characters, because if you simply changed a character, that wouldn't work. Although if you deleted a word, that would work, or you added a word, that would work. But so we have this idea of checksums. And it seems they invented it. at least 4,000 years ago, in the terms of meter and rhyme and other linguistic properties, whereby if a syllable were not stressed exactly the right way, somebody would automatically know that they had not done the right thing, that they had mismemorized, mismemorized it, they had misspoken. So, and the other point to remember is there's sort of two types of texts. There are sort of religious holy texts where there is a social goal of conservatism. And then there's sort of folk tales, which are templates where storytellers are meant to change the topic to match the people they're speaking to. And in fact, there's some thought that the Jataka tales originate actually from that trend of oral storytelling. Is that you would have these situations, storytellers read these situations, and you have this template of a Jataka tale, which is basically this is some moral story about what something happened in one of the Buddha's previous lives, and they change it to match the audience that they're talking to. So the kinds of things that people use are repetition of words, phrases, passages, and even whole sutras. Anyone who's read the Pali Canon has experienced that. The standardization of words, phrases, and passages. Some of this is a little bit more obvious in Pali than it is in English. The use of synonyms, the waxing syllable principle, sound similarities, concatenation of sutras. So I do this when I learn folk music. You just don't learn a single reel or jig. You learn them in sets so that you can bunch them up together in your memory, which makes it a little hard when you play live and somebody plays the tunes in a different order, because you expect, when you finish playing one song in traditional Irish music, you play each tune. They're not songs, they're tunes. You play them 3 times. A, B, A, B, A, B. And then you go on to the next one, and you go on to the next one. And so you learn sets of them, and by doing that, you sort of you rely on some the chunking properties of human memory. Use formal structures like ABA. Use summary and exposition, framing narratives, verse summaries, similes, so you remember the simile. And who doesn't love a numbered list? And group recitals, which are actually attested to in the Nikayas themselves. Like the Buddha says you should recite all these things. So that's sort of the first thing. It's interesting to me that in their long thing, like textual transmission is not where they start. It's actually the third block of evidence that they use. For me, it's a little more interesting to start with oral transmission, because I just like think, how is that even possible? So the group recitals are important, and one of the interesting historical sort of vagaries of the early Sangha is that there was no pope. So there was never really a time in the early Buddhist Sangha where there was one person who could sort of take control of the teachings, start changing things. As long as you have this large group, a decentralized structure of the Sangha, it actually tends to be more conservative rather than inventive. And we actually see that because there was an emphasis on the proper recital, we can actually see that anytime there's a new doctrinal element, it ends up in commentaries. So it ends up in new material, which then gets memorized. So the whole sort of edifice process, social process, is geared towards memorizing everything as best we can as it is. And if we change anything, that gets added as a commentary and new text and everything else. And there's a sort of a group peer pressure to keep everything sort of consistent. So there's pretty much, well, no doubt that the Buddha didn't speak Pali. So I don't think anyone is trying to claim that at the present time. Now, if we look at sort of the authenticity deniers, most of them are claiming that the Pali Canon doesn't really come into existence, or at least the early Buddhist texts. So again, not like Abhidharma, even the Patimoksha, the Vinaya is a little bit dicey, and we'll go into that in a minute. So we just look again, say basically the four main Nikayas, the Samuels and the Chopins are saying that no, this was all composed by Buddhaghosa in the 5th or 6th century in Sri Lanka. But if we look at the Pali of the early Buddhist texts, its structure firmly places it in a time period between the Buddha and Ashoka, and that it has absolutely no Sinhalese elements in it, which later commentaries do. They have Dravidian and Sinhalese elements of Pali, but the early Buddhist texts don't have it. And so just by way of reference, I think I meant to talk about the timeline. So the general timeline we work with, this is called the median reckoning, is that the Buddha was born in about 480 BCE. Parinibbana is in 400, so the whole 4 the first council is in 399. Based on other texts and what people know, the last historical verifiable reference in the early Buddhist texts refers to something that we know had to have happened no later than 350 BCE. And that is in the Book of Fives, Anguttara Sutta, in the Book of Fives, the Narada Sutta. There's a conversation between King Munda, and we know his dates, and the Bhikkhu Narada. So what's interesting is it's not a conversation with the Buddha, it's a conversation with one of the monks at a later time. And that is the last that's the last historical event recorded in the Pali Canon. By 322, so this is just, 40 years? Oh, wait, 322. No, 100 years. Let's see. Buddha does in 400. 78 years. I always hate BCE because it's going backwards. So at roughly 80 years after the Buddha's death, the entire political landscape of the Gangetic Plain changes. We have Nanda. We actually see this happening in the early Buddhist texts with, there's a passage, I forget whether it's Pasenadi or Bimbisara. So Pasenadi is there's 16 kingdoms across the Gangetic Plain. The big ones we know about, Kosala, and that's King Pasenadi. And the Sakyas are the vassals, and the Kolyas are the vassals of Kosala. And then there's Magadha with King Bimbisara. And that's actually where the Buddha spends most of his time teaching. It's Rajagriha is there. That eventually becomes the Nanda dynasty and begins conquering the Gangetic Plain. And they're actually, it's known as the first historical dynasty because it's actually referenced by the Greeks. So there's an independent reference of that dynasty by the Greeks because Alexander the Great got to India just 4 years prior. So he gets to India, his troops mutiny because they're like, we're not fighting another battle. We're really tired and we want to go home. So he says, okay. He meets some Sramanas, famously meets some Sramanas, and he's believed that he might have met some Buddhists. And he stops. There's cultural exchange. it opens up the ancient world. This is where we start to get big trade between Europe, Greece, and India. So big between Europe at that time and Asia. About 30 years later is Kandagutta, who is the first pan-Indian emperor. And just before that, in 300, had been the second council. And by 269, we start with the reign of Asoka. So there's a huge change afterwards. And this is actually instrumental to Sujata and Brahmali's argument. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to, so that was the time context when we talk about all of that going on in the 200-ish years after the Buddha's death, 150 versus another 600 to 700 years later for the 5th and 6th century AD or CE. So the Pali of the Pali Canon is old. It's much older than sort of the mixing that you get later. So there's one of the things that sort of is lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, is there came to be multiple copies of a lot of the main Nikayas. And so there are multiple transmissions of these early Buddhist texts through separate lineages. So one is the Sarvastivadin, which ends up being the Agamas in Chinese, and the Mahavihara, which are the Pali versions. And people have gone through and compared the Majjhima Nikaya, for example, point, and they're able to demonstrate that although these lineages separated by the time of Asoka, there were centuries of oral transmission afterwards. So they were at least to have a common base at the time of Asoka, because there were the Asoka's emissaries who went to China, which we'll get to in many talks later. And then those who went down to eventually to Sri Lanka, but who were mainly in the subcontinent. And it's just sort of a weird thing to suppose that once these groups split, all of a sudden they decided to become conservative. So in terms of preserving the texts as sort of dictated. So that they must have been conservative prior to that. So it's kind of difficult. It's not impossible, but it is sort of difficult to conceive of the reverse, where there was a tradition of very liberal inventiveness that all of a sudden came to an end in two separate groups. Like two groups at the same time decided, no, we have to preserve these texts exactly, because from generation to generation, well, basically student to teacher, it's like, some consistently large group of students would all have to have decided at the same time, let's stop inventing new stuff in two different spots. And there have been similar studies for the Samyutta Nikaya and the Agamas, and the Digha Nikayas and the Agamas. And basically you get the same result. There's a high degree of fidelity. There's changes in words. An interesting thing is that this fidelity does not exist for other Buddhist texts composed at about the same time that also have been split. So, for example, there are actually large differences in the versions of the Dhammapada. And the divergences get larger for the Abhidharma. And they're actually even fairly large for the Vinaya. And the Vinaya is an interesting case, because one thing that you could argue Is it, well, the reason that these separate lineages are so close, Zoom is trying to be helpful. The reason that these lineages of text are so close is because they borrowed from earlier texts and inserted it into current text. And we'll talk about later why that's probably not true. The theories of later borrowing have largely been disproven, and they don't comport with the totality of evidence, which we'll go into. So, because what generally happens is when you borrow, like you borrow, those of us who give talks, like we borrow a paragraph, and then you add your own stuff. You borrow maybe more and you add your own stuff around it, your own commentary. So you would expect for there then to be more inconsistencies between these lineages of texts. And there aren't for the early Nikayas. But interestingly enough, it actually happens for the Vinaya. So the Patimokkha, which are the main vows in the Vinaya, those are almost always consistent across the different versions. But the secondary precepts are often, and explanations are often vastly different. So we actually have examples of what borrowing does. And basically what I'm saying is most of the time when you borrow, there are seams. You can find the seams between things. And when we compare the Nikayas and the Agamas, we don't see them. And when we get to the Vinaya, there are bigger seams. There can be obvious seams. When we get to the Abhidharma, and they're just really large seams. So the main ideas then is that we really shouldn't automatically discount oral transmission. That there are a large array of tactics that can be marshaled, and especially in a culture where this was important to the people. And that if it were the case that where there were things like, since we have texts we can compare in different lineages and we find that there are very small differences, we can have confidence that they had at least a common root, and we can pinpoint that common root certainly before the 5th century AD. And if it really did come from borrowings, we would see seams, and there aren't any seams. So it is on the topic now of seams I kind of want to return, because it's sort of the main the thrust of the evidence of where those seams would be. So as I mentioned, the history right after the Buddha, everything changes, and you can actually see it in the early Buddhist texts. I'm trying to remember who it was. I started this story a minute ago, and I said I would tell it now. So I think it's Pasenadi wants to know how to conquer, I think it's the Fijians. I think they were the last republic, or they could be the Lavachis. They were the last republic. And the Buddha basically tells him, like, he doesn't intentionally do it, but he's like, I would sow discord, and I would do this, and I would do this. And then Pasenadi basically says, well, yeah, thank you for the tip. Thank you for the tips. It might have actually been Bimbisara. And we had already seen then that by the time of the Buddha, Sakya and Kaliya were vassal states of Kosala, and this continues. And so, in the early Buddhist texts, there are no historical anachronisms. They correctly describe the political state of the Gangetic Plain at the time of the Buddha. Now, if we could say, it's like, well, all these 16 countries, they continued for the next 500 years. So, everybody sort of knew the history and they knew who had fought what or whatever. There's just common knowledge. And so it was not difficult to sort of make this up in 500 AD. But it all changed very quickly after the Buddha. And another thing that the early Buddhist texts correctly identify the state of economic development at the time. So it was really interesting. They were talking about how the Vedas, because of I guess it has to be because of the tricks and mnemonics they use for oral transmission, things are not actually easy to change. So at the time of the Buddha, we have this change from a purely agrarian society to sort of a mix. There are big cities. The Buddha is always teaching around big cities. There is the earlier sort of republics. There's only one left. We have now kings. They can afford, there's a surplus. There's an agricultural surplus that allows you to feed a standing army, and there's the growth of trades in the cities, goldsmiths, silversmiths, tailor, weavers, and all of that sort of thing. But none of that is mentioned in the Vedic texts. So the Vedic texts have, because of the memorization, it takes a snapshot of rural life in northern India at the time. They were composed and memorized. And the early Buddhist texts do the same thing for the time of the Buddha. Because shortly after that, it changes. Alexander the Great comes, meets up with India. Although there had been Indians who fought, there was a trade route from Taxila in Persia, all the way through the northern part of India. But there wasn't quite as much. There was a little bit known about Greece, but they didn't know the names of specific emperors, and they didn't know specifics. And all of that changes after Alexander. There are ambassadors from India, from the Mauryan, from Asoka's empire in Greece. There are Buddhists in Greece, which is another interesting topic, following the meeting of the cultures with Alexander the Great, and certainly in the years thereafter, by the time of Asoka, and certainly by the time of Zero with the Roman Empire, there are Buddhists in Rome as part of the ambassadorial staff. So there's all these kinds of things that are just somehow. So this is what we're meant to believe, is that somehow Buddhaghosa in 500 AD made up or selectively consolidated what the Buddha taught, but also somehow remembered precisely the political, economic, and social structure of the Buddhist time. So somehow they remembered one thing orally for 800 years, but they didn't remember the other thing for 800 years. And then you match it. And this is why it's kind of one of those preponderance of evidence things, because it's and not only that, if Buddhaghosa had changed it, why does it match the Agamas? The other thing is, and the interesting thing is, the later Mahayana texts, and let's not, we don't need to mix words. A lot of the naysayers are Mahayanists. So, because there's this thing is everything was kind of written down at the same time, because it's, sort of writing was discovered and people wanted to start writing things down. But even then, some of the things we talk about. So, for example, there are Mahayana sutras where the Buddha meets Asoka. It's a sutra that discuss, it's the Buddha and Asoka talking to each other, but that could never have happened. And there are anachronisms in the Mahayana sutras where it's just not possible that people could have known those things at the time. So that's the other interesting thing is we can see what happens when these things do happen. So for example, writing is never mentioned in the Nikayas, but it is mentioned in Mahayana Sutras because writing didn't exist. It hadn't existed yet. Well, they lost it. It was in the Indus plain for a while and then that lost. So I sort of want to wrap this up. There's a lot, it's a really interesting paper. There's a lot of stuff in it. It's one of those things where you read it and you sort of go, oh yeah, okay, I can sort of like, and again, the goal isn't really to say is like, oh, this is true. It's just that, yeah, this is probably came right after that 200 span time after the Buddha. So I'm gonna quote so Gethin says, far from representing sectarian Buddhism, which is often the claim, the four Nikayas, above all, constitute a common ancient heritage of Buddhism. Additionally, some surviving texts are undoubtedly the Otis Sutra texts, and some go back to the Buddha himself, right? So you might have the early Buddhist texts. Some of them are the oldest, and some of them probably are what were, or some remember of what the Buddha actually said. Gombrich says the content of the main body of sermons, the four Nikayas, the main body of monastic rules, presents such an originality, intelligence, grandeur, and most relevantly, coherence that it's difficult to see it as a composite work. Harvey says much of the Pali Canon must derive from the Buddhist teachings. I quoted De Jong. Riet says, though the Pali Canon obviously exaggerates and mythologizes the qualities of the Buddha, with regard to his teachings, they have the appearance of constituting, for the most part, a faithful and accurate record. Yeah, we'll stop there because next time that's the basis of the next. So yeah, it's just interesting to me because sometimes it's in Christianity a lot they talk about the difference between what the theologians think and the view from the pews. So the view from the pews tends to still be very much like, God has a beard and he sits on a throne. And most of the theologians are like so past that I don't even know if you can consider them to be theists anymore. And you just don't, and I know from my own field, not so much in the modern era, but certainly 100 years ago in the 1900s, there's a lot of name calling in the scholarly literature. And I certainly get a sense of that here, where it's like, oh, he's a jerk and da 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 da, but that aside, I think it's like thoughtful, competent people have analyzed these things, and I think they've come to conclusions that we can trust, and we don't have to quite be so embarrassed about stuff. I'm trying to find, there was a great quote, it might have been at the end, but it basically was something that Dokai had said in the past, which is like, there's some good stuff in there and there's some bad stuff in there, but we really don't have to doubt too much when it was composed. So, well, I know Dokai doesn't say the second part. Dokai says the first part. There's good stuff and there's bad stuff. Maybe stuff is not quite as relevant. So maybe I'll let Dokai tell me what he says.
Well, I certainly think there's some good stuff. Some of it I really resonate with very well. Some of it I don't. um, I'm kind of not so interested in the jhanic states, which occur quite often, and you know, yeah, maybe was into those or maybe not. I don't know. But some things are like I read in the canon are the Buddha has to be born in India. A Buddha has to be born in India, and a Buddha cannot be a woman. So it's a little hard for me to believe those things were actually said by the Buddha. Um, I th- the logical explanation for me is when Buddhism started to thrive outside of India and people out there started to be some really kind of powerful people rising who did not live in India. And then I kind of think the Indians said, well, who were powerful, said, somehow it got added in, well, actually a Buddha has to be born in India. So, but it was hard for me to imagine the Buddha saying that because he probably didn't, Buddha didn't, there was no Buddhism outside of India when the Buddha was,
Well, there was no India. Like there's
yeah,
just
well,
no
no India, and not even in India. So,
Yeah. It would be interesting. I'd like to go find that and see what it
yeah, I'd
actually,
have to, boy, I don't know if I could ever find it again, but maybe it's,
or whether it's even in the four main Nikayas or not.
well, I'm pretty sure that's where I read it, but it was years ago, and I have no idea where, and it'd be pretty hard to find. And the same with women.
Yeah.
It was sort of a non-issue in Buddha's time. So I kind of propose that it's when women started to actually have great insight and be recognized as powerful teachers that probably some guys thought, no,
Mhm.
no, it's got to be men. It's got to be, it can't be a woman. So um, I just can't see why the Buddha would say that during his time. But
Well, so again, the claim is not that everything came directly from the Buddha straight out at, 399 First Council, but that it's not that far removed.
mm-hmm.
One of the arguments that they make, which is interesting, is Buddhism had spread all across the subcontinent by the time of Ashoka,
Mm-hmm.
which means that there has to be time for that to happen. So the teachings had to be like transmitted and codified before that point. Now, yeah, so I'm with you. I mean, certainly things were added, but I mean, if you look at the 150-year span after the Buddha, I can certainly fit that kind of nonsense into it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Anyway, I
yeah,
just
I don't think it was from 500. Well, I mean, it could be. It could. I mean, that would have been the time to add in those kinds of things. Like I'm writing it down now for the first time, and that makes it sort of easy to insert a few things that
Mhm.
are,
Yeah, well, you know, basically I mean, it's the same with Dogen. If I read stuff, there's some that I really resonate with, and some stuff, mm, let's just let this one go. So, at least for me, I don't feel like I have to believe everything that's said, and not. I mean, there is an element of my lack of awareness might make me not able to understand something. So I'm discriminating between that and also this just isn't right, something like that. So it's a line we have to find, and so it's kind of just how I practice
so
study,
that
study.
thank you for that because that's an interesting question, but one I don't think we can take up today. Maybe it's a really, but I always wonder about this, because we have a great variety of Buddhist teachings and schools of thought, and you can see commonalities, and they're also very different in some ways. And the question that I always think about is, at what point are you not a Buddhist anymore? It's like, at what point are you just, is it picking and choosing? And
Mm-hmm.
um, I always think of it in terms of, well, is this are you just thinking that because it's convenient and doesn't cost you anything to like change the way you think about the world? But that may take us a little bit off track.
Yeah.
Yeah. Aaron, Carl, of course, there's not much tracking.
Well, we don't have much time, but this is I'm getting an echo from the TV in the other room, which has just got my name on it. Yeah, the stories, I think the teachings are probably pretty consistent. The framing of the teachings, I think, even in the oral tradition, got, tweaked a lot to make it, a competitive story, to popularize the teachings. I mean, they weren't shy about that. And, Kashyapa, who, wasn't supposed to take over, but did take over after the Buddha. I mean, he was a self-promoting, Brahmin and self-important, and he was too important to teach the monks himself. Anyway, so Pali, I believe, was a written language, but the spoken languages, which are called Pakrits, what the Buddha spoke normally was a related Pakrit. So they weren't that far apart, but it was not Pali that he was speaking to.
Right. There's a little bit of, they're trying to, it's really hard. It's amazing they can reconstruct these things, but the structure of Pali in the Pali Canon does not quite exactly match the spoken Pakrit of exactly where the Buddha was, but sort of adjacent.
Right.
Some weird thing, but it doesn't have any of the Sri Lankan or Sinhalese elements in it.
Yeah. But my reading is they keep talking about that the Pali Canon, the Agamas, the Tibetan texts, that translated one that I sent you from 1890, that they were based on a common source, which has been lost. And I mean, there are too many commonalities, in the different versions, that there wasn't some kind of common source that these people based their stuff on anyway.
Right. Yeah,
it's all pretty interesting.
The argument there is that it's probably more fidelity than we're willing to give credit, because to simply base things, it would be hard for anachronisms not to creep in. So, for example, how we talk about dialing a phone, even though none of us dial a phone anymore.
Yep.
So that's what it's kind of hard to just keep those little things out, like misremembering who the king is or the political boundaries. And they see that in the Mahayana texts, but they don't see it in at least the four main Nikayas.
One of the things that they mention is, it's a funny thing about India at that time, or that area of India at that time, is they weren't concerned very much about history. They didn't write historical stuff.
Right.
But when you go over the stories in the Pali Canon, there's a lot of history in there. That's incidental kind of to the story, the teaching that they're doing, but there is a lot of history there on Pasenadi and Bimbisara and the other characters that keep showing up in the story. Banking was just taking off, and one of his guys was a big banker. And so anyway.
Yeah, but those are points in favor of the authenticity, not the opposite, because if you don't remember history, you wouldn't remember what history to insert.
Right. And I think, there's a lot of added material in the Pali Canon, but the core of it, I believe, is not in doubt. At least from the arguments that I've seen, and there are people that don't even think the Buddha existed. He was a made up character. But, it is a lot of consistency within the teachings. And then there's a lot of added materials there to kind of promote those teachings or make them more accessible to,
Well, that was it. And a lot of it has changed. And I think, and so I certainly go back to Zhejiang's quote, where it's, the basic ideas of Buddhism found in the canonical writings could very well have been proclaimed by the Buddha, transmitted and developed by disciples, and finally codified. And so, yeah, that's 150 years worth of work. But the thing I find interesting is if you have to imagine the other way that these things were written down, and there are other interesting things is that the Pali Canon, the early Buddhist texts. So I'm not going to say the Pali Canon because we all know that this is not true of Abhidharma. It is only partially true of the Vinaya, but it's basically the four main Nikayas. The Jain texts composed at about the same time are consistent with them as well. You're muted, Carl.
Yeah, the Jain texts are even earlier than the Buddhist texts. Some of them, I know, the Brahma Viharas are mentioned in the Jain texts.
Yep.
Before the Buddha started talking about them. But the thing about the oral transmission, Stephen Batchelor talked about some studies that they've done with the Brahmanic oral tradition that was passed down from generation to generation. And over centuries, the consistency of that oral tradition that's been passed down, it matched almost identically with one's centuries later in a completely different part of India, and that those things did match up. And so there was some strong consistency there in the oral tradition. It was something that they were familiar with, memorization and the lists, the famous lists of Buddhism, because that's the easiest way to remember stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, So anyway,
it's very
thanks,
cool.
Jushin.
Yeah, I just because I think it's hard, and I think for us, especially, like, I'm sure all of us remember a time when we knew all of our important phone numbers by heart. Like we just knew all the phone numbers. I know 2 anymore, and the area codes have changed, so I always have to go remember what the area code was. I remember my 2 home phone numbers. I remember them, but the area codes have changed, so it's messed up. Aaron, did you have anything to add in the last couple of minutes? Sorry.
No, we're out of time. I'm good. Thank you. Very interesting though. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I don't think we have to go, oh, this means it's true or useful, but it's like we don't have to quite be so embarrassed about quoting the Pali Canon.
All right. Well, thank you, Jushin. Seems a little not relevant to go over our events and speakers, but anyway, next week is Kyoku. Oh, and just for your information, Jushin, I think if you're taking care of the website, we have I think there's an error with Jeremy and Onru. They both have the same date, June 23rd.
Oh, that's so weird.
I don't think they're co-speaking together.
They're not co-speaking, and I thought I changed that. So,
well, anyway, I just was looking.
Oh, weird.
So Jeremy, I think, is the 16th, and Onru
Yeah, it is.
23rd. And
Yeah,
then
Jeremy.
Reverend Aaron Davis will be speaking to us
Hey.
June 30th. Well, there's the retreats by GD coming up in Clouds and Water, and the family weekend in July. So There's the Mahakala radio retreat, also starting on June 9th. And they're just finishing this just sitting retreat today, and there's a number of people there who we're all very familiar with. So it's kind of a good group. Bill Trash, Lee Lewis, Rushin, Kim Napako, others too. So they're it's a good. I think it's been a very good retreat. Henry Panowich was there, so is there. So yeah, it's very nice. Apparently they're very good at keeping quiet. That's what. So I got that. Henry came up and talked to me yesterday, and he said, "Boy, are these people quiet." so, so anyway, well, that's it. Let's just close with the four vows, then. We will do that. And, okay, beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Okay. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.